Hello, good evening, everyone, and happy Lunar New Year. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. My name is Sophie Lowe, and I'm the Director of Visitor Services and Program Management at the museum at Eldridge Street. I want to thank you all for joining us today for our inaugural program in our new series, Restoring Stories, featuring our wonderful friends and colleagues from Evergreen Architectural Arts. This series is specifically dedicated to exploring the preservation, conservation, and restoration efforts at the Eldridge Street Synagogue. Now, before we begin, please know that all of us at Eldridge Street, we hope you and your family are safe and well during these unprecedented times. And in light of the current global crisis, like so many other organizations, we've moved our programming online. And we're so thankful that you've chosen to join us and continue learning with us tonight. For those of you who are new to us today, please be sure to check the Eldridge Street website and social media platforms to keep up to date with all of our different programs and our events. And if you have any questions during the session, please enter them in the Q&A box on your Zoom screen, and we will get to as many questions throughout the program. Now, I am really delighted to introduce our Director of Public Engagement, Chelsea Dowell, who's going to be introducing tonight's featured speakers. Chelsea, who has a background in historic preservation, will be moderating the talk tonight. Chelsea, please take it away.
Thanks, Sophie. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being with us tonight. As Sophie said, my name is Chelsea Dowell, and I'm really excited to be talking with Jeff and Emily today and all of you about Evergreen's work at Eldridge Street as well as at other sacred spaces. To me, historic preservation is so much more than about just saving a building. It goes deeper than that. It illuminates a bygone time, it teaches, it connects us to people just like us or not at all like us who came before. And I think it's that human element, the cultural element that makes the Eldridge Street restoration so compelling. And I have a feeling we'll probably hear a lot more about that aspect of the job as we begin our talk today. For those of you who are not familiar with the particulars of the Eldridge Street Synagogue and the museum at Eldridge Street, it was built in 1887 by Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe. These immigrants were part of the massive wave of immigration to America in the late 19th century. Around that time, 2.5 million Jewish immigrants fled their home countries, and about 75% of them ended up settling on the Lower East Side. So it was a crowded neighborhood, and it was also a very poor neighborhood. But through the business success and the aspirations and probably a little bit of luck of some of the leaders of the congregation, the Eldridge Street congregation was able to design and build this grand, really magnificent synagogue in their neighborhood. And it was actually the first synagogue built by Eastern European Jews in America. So right from the start, this is a building whose design and very existence symbolizes the arrival of these immigrants to America, not only physically, but culturally, and their freedom to practice religion, not only just publicly, but actually exuberantly. That massive wave of immigration that so quickly developed the Lower East Side into an iconic Jewish neighborhood, it was halted pretty starkly in 1924 by an immigration quota that was passed in America. And this marks the beginning of the decline of the neighborhood and of the synagogue as well, or the decline of the Jewish aspect of the neighborhood, I should say. No longer were massive waves of Jewish immigrants flooding into the neighborhood practically on a daily basis. And the same was true for places like the Eldridge Street Synagogue and many other synagogues in the neighborhood. And eventually the dwindling congregation could no longer afford to maintain their grand sanctuary. And in the 1940s, they locked the door and they used just a small, modest basement level space for prayer. And the sanctuary actually languished behind locked doors for decades. It wasn't until the late 1970s when the space was rediscovered and our founder, preservationist Roberta Brandes Gratz, took on the monumental task of getting the building preserved and restored. And that's really where Evergreen comes in. And we are delighted to be joined tonight by two experts from the Evergreen team. Jeff Green is an artist, innovator, and the executive chairman and founder of Evergreen Architectural Arts. His interests in history, public art, and mankind's use of ornament fueled his creation of a company devoted to the preservation of architectural legacy in communities throughout the nation. Under Jeff's guidance, Evergreen has grown from the small painting studio it was in 1978 to one of the leading specialty contractors in the United States. Jeff earned his BFA at the Art Institute of Chicago and received a fresco scholarship to the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture. He has spearheaded Evergreen's large-scale conservation, restoration, and new design work on national treasures such as the Chrysler Building, Radio City Music Hall, the Library of Congress, the US Capitol Building, Grace Church, and King's Theater. You might have heard of a few of those. We're very lucky that we're in that company. Emily Sotilli is director of the Sacred Space Studio at Evergreen. Emily draws on formal training in art history and theology and over a decade of hands-on experience at Evergreen, bringing large-scale restoration and new design projects to fruition. She works closely with clergy, architects, and committees to develop artistry and restoration programs that support the liturgy and architecture. As an adjunct professor at St. Joseph's Seminary, Dunwoody in Yonkers, New York, Emily lectures on beauty and the new evangelization. Emily holds a BA in History of Art from Rhodes College in Memphis, Tennessee, an MA/MS in History of Art from the University of Edinburgh, Scotland, and is currently pursuing an MA in Theology at St. Joseph's College in Standish, Maine. Jeff and Emily, welcome.
Glad to be here. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
It looks
so
like
glad to have you here.
It looks like I'm in Eldridge Street, but you know it's just a photograph.
if only.
Yes.
So I guess what I'll do first is just lay the groundwork a little bit for the topics that we'll get to tonight or hope to get to tonight. I want to start by talking a little bit about how Evergreen uses the history of a site to inform or elevate a restoration project. And hopefully we'll talk a little bit about what are the stories that you kind of uncover through the ornamentation and the decoration at places like Eldridge Street. Then I hope to get to some more technical questions. How do you go about starting such a massive job? What tools do you use? Who gets to make the decisions about the future of a building that has so much past like ours did? And then hopefully we'll end with some questions about similar projects of yours and what comes after a restoration is complete. Hopefully we'll get to all of that. We've got big ambitions.
Okay. Well, I think the place to start, I mean, to answer your question about, and the reason we put these two side-by-side photographs here is to talk about the history of the building in style and context. But maybe the place to start is my impressions. And I like very much your introduction about, what do buildings mean to people? And in a certain way, they're, repositories for our memory and placeholders for events in people's lives. So not just what goes on inside the building, but also the facade of the building and how it contributes to the entire neighborhood. But I have to relate the first time that I went into Eldridge Street, and as you mentioned, there was barely a minyan meeting, on Shabbos in the basement, and the upstairs was abandoned. There actually had homeless people and pigeons, and it was completely abandoned for decades and decades and decades. But the first time I went in there, I got goosebumps, and the hair on my arm stood up, and you could feel something in the space. And my entire life have made a search all over the world, literally, of trying to find spaces that when you walk into them, you feel something. Many people talk about going to Chartres outside of Paris and feeling something when they go in there. I can say that I've been to Uzbekistan, to Naqshband's tomb, and there's something there, all right, or Rumi's tomb in Konya, in Turkey. There are places like that in America. The village in North Dakota where Sacagawea came from. There's a sense of something was deposited there. There's some powerful feeling that many people feel. I can't say what it is, but it existed when I went to Eldridge Street. The first time I went in there, it was like, what is this place? There's something sort of magical, mysterious, and otherworldly about it. It's also, if anybody knows the New Old Shul in Prague, the old synagogue, the new old synagogue, they call it from the 1300s, the new old synagogue from the 1300s. I had that same feeling there. So there are a number of places. I've had it, in Benares, in India, on the Ganges. There's certain places that just have this, for lack of a better word, I'll say spiritual quality. And Eldridge Street is one of those unique places. So, and also there's a little family lore. My grandfather, Samuel Greenbaum, came to New York from what was then Russia. And he spent a year in New York. When he arrived when he was 13 years old by himself. And we like to believe that this is where he would have worshiped when he lived on the Lower East Side. And I might also add that the name Evergreen, his name was Samuel Greenbaum. My father shortened it to Green. And that's where the name Evergreen comes from my grandfather. So there's that personal connection as well.
Well, we're happy to have you say, to make up whatever family connection that you'd like. We'll go right along with that.
Everyone needs a mythology, right?
Exactly. Yeah, we've got a couple of our own at Eldridge Street for sure. So you mentioned this really intangible sense of spirituality, of community when you walk into a space. And I also heard you say, I don't know what it is, but I guess if you had to guess, or if you can kind of conjure up some of the context around how something like that, how a feeling like that sort of embeds itself, like you said, in the building. Is it the design? Is it the patina on the building from use? Like how do you sort of determine the life of the building and where to start with it?
Well, I think if one has an understanding of the context of the building from a historical point of view, and let Emily talk a little bit about this. I mean, the building, the style of the building, so there's that sort of formalistic element. I mean, that doesn't really answer the question as to how it connects with people emotionally. And, one can imagine that, maybe the thousands and thousands of prayers that are say there are deposit something physical in the actual, I'm a bricks and mortar guy, I mean, we work with our hands, we're craftspeople, but there's also this other, I don't know what you call it, something that goes on, right? That is really the essence of what's important, which is how buildings affect people, how they make them feel, all right? And it's not the same for everybody, but Eldridge Street is quite remarkable in that many, 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 many people identify with it and feel something when they go inside. And so I'll digress from the mystical qualities to the concrete ones and talk a little bit about the style of the building and I actually had some revelations about things that I hadn't understood about the building in preparing for our talk tonight, which I thought I want to talk about as well. But
I would say that, it is this incredible dance between these ineffable things and these very concrete things. And like our work is to, use that language because of the architecture, because the architecture and the art speak, and always. I had a professor who said that architecture doesn't lie. So it always tells you things about itself. It tells you about the community. It tells you about its tradition. And, when it's done well, it can really move you spiritually and emotionally. And then of course it gets married up with all this history. And, you have this sort of things that we can identify and talk to you about tonight and things that we couldn't possibly put our finger on, but they, as a marriage, they work to create exactly what Jeff was talking about.
So the reason we put up these exterior pictures is the style of the architecture, and you can see it also behind me, we'll talk about it in some detail, comes out of the late Victorian revivalist period when fantasy architecture was, I'll say fantasy, I mean, revivalist architecture was being done in many, many, many different styles. And both in America and in Europe, largely Ashkenazi communities were looking back to their origins in the Middle East and adapting Moorish architecture and the keystone arches. So that's reflected here. It's an interesting amalgamation of, Gothic rose window and these more Oriental or Moorish styles.
Very romantic.
Yes. So it's interesting to understand it on that level, on one part, and we can move forward and start to look at some of the pictures we have. Well, okay, good. It's not working. Let's see if we can move this forward here. There we go. And all the gingerbread had been stripped off. This is, how people experience on the street. And it's a narrow street, Eldridge Street down there. And so you sort of come upon the building. And then if you look up, it's like, what is this doing here? It doesn't, it's completely different than anything else in the neighborhood. And in the restoration, which by the way, we started in 1986 and didn't finish until 2007. So that's a little patience there. And then we went back several years later when they did replace the stained glass and did the Bema wall. But here they are putting back all the gingerbread and all the detail on the top of the building, putting it back to what it was originally.
I think it's interesting to think about the decision to make a building in this style, for a group of people, immigrant people, and to give thought to how it is that they would like to imagine themselves in this new world and where they're coming from. And even though these people are coming from the Eastern Europe, sort of where they're coming from way before that in the Middle East, and then also as a destination point in the Promised Land. So this sort of relationship from who you are, where you come from, and where you're going.
But part of the other thing that, as I said, I had this little thought that was a new thought. I was looking in preparing for our talk at some of the wooden shuls from the shetels of Eastern Europe that are completely covered in decoration. And this is the Victorian maxim of horror vacui, fear of unadorned space, and covering it with pattern and decoration. And that there's a connection between how the interior, the style of the inside of the decoration is somewhat vernacular. It's not high style. It's done in a kind of folksy way. And I think there's something about the decoration of the wooden shtetl shuls, synagogues in Eastern Europe, that would make someone coming to America, even though it's in this, I'll call it fantasy style of the Middle East, there's a connection there, which I hadn't really made before, of all this decoration done in a rather simple way. And there's this kind of folk quality or character to it, which lends it a kind of authenticity, because it's common to what they would have had in the tenements and the way they decorated their houses, and this need to humanize that environment in a certain way and fill it full of decoration. And it's also, and Emily, you can speak to this, also a celebration of, there are other levels of symbolism to the decoration as well. As we can go to the inside now.
Beth, just a quick question from someone in the crowd, a quite timely one. Can you explain what you refer to when you're talking about the gingerbread on the building?
Well, let's go back then, if we can go backwards and forwards. By the way, this is a Plum Street. Yeah, okay. You can see that these finials and the crenellation and the all of this had been stripped away and was added back in. That's what I'm talking about by gingerbread, by the decoration that was added. It's not structural to the building at all. It's just pure ornament.
Great, thank you.
And I just included this as another example of, this is the Isaac Weiss Temple, also called Plum Street Temple in Cincinnati. It looks like a mosque. It's completely Middle Eastern. It's just to show another example. This is another evergreen project that we did of that there were other buildings like this of the same period of time. So this is what it looked like in 1985 or 86. Well, we started the work in 86. I probably looked at it in 83, 84, 85, when Joseph Caviglia, one of the early preservation architects in New York, was then in charge of the project. And, with the ladders and debris and peeling paint and water damage, and the windows that you're looking at there, it was blown out. There was a round rondelle window or rose window there that had been blown out in a 1939 tornado or hurricane. And they replaced it with this glass block. But one gets a sense of how dilapidated the building was, but also how evocative it was. And one of the maxims throughout the whole project was, you can't make it look new. You have to maintain the patina. And I'll just show a few pictures beforehand so one gets a sense of what we dealt with.
And Jeff, I think that's a perfect moment to, I want to talk maybe after this question about how you get started on a project as massive as the one we're looking at right now, that clearly has so much work to be done. But maybe before we even get there, when you're looking at this building and you're talking about wanting to preserve not only the decoration and the architecture, but also that sense of time, the human element of the building, how do you do something like that? And if people are preservationists or restorers in the audience, they might know there's this period of significance that a project will want to identify before they begin restoration. And I am imagining that in this case, you would want to restore to the period of significance without making it seem brand new, like you were saying. And so how do you determine something like that in a project this large and in a building that had been through clearly so much over the decades?
Funny that you should ask that. I'm going to get to that. At first, I want to show what condition it was, but the period of significance, we had to establish what that was. In other words, so as a building ages and has all these campaigns of restoration, for instance, on the left here, I think it's left on your screen as well, you can see that these domes were all painted over blue. And of course the plaster was in terrible shape. Let's just keep going. I just want to show a few pictures of how bad it was here. There's the wonderful chandelier, large section ceilings gone, plaster completely gone. And these pendentives here, peeling paint, but as we did our research, we found out what was underneath them. So let's keep going. So these are all, now this room is go back one, please. This room is very significant. This is the entryway. And so to answer your question, how did we go about it? We did a paint study, and I'll get to that in half a second. But in this particular room, you can see that the ceilings are quite damaged. The plaster's falling off the wall. And so we looked at chips of paint under the microscope in cross section. And by the time we got to this room 20 years later, all of the plaster was gone. Everything was gone. So all we had was the record of those little paint chips, the size, quite small, quarter the size of your little fingernail, even smaller than that you're looking at in cross section. And that was all the evidence we had of what the colors were and the patterns were that we had documented. But as we discovered in this investigation phase, there were many periods. So here we are looking at it under the microscope, doing our forensic examination. Here's a cross section of a paint layer. And in this, you can see, I have a pointer, but the dark layer between the yellow and the beige is probably a dirt layer. That means that level was exposed to the pollution in the air, or it could have been a glaze. We'd have to do an exposure window, and I'll show you those in a minute to understand what it looked like. Here's another paint stratigraphy, and you can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, about 20 layers of paint there. And that's what we had at Eldridge Street. We had multiple layers of paint, multiple campaigns of paint, multiple levels of decoration. And we had to sort that out and say, which ones fit with which ones. So it would also tell us, excuse me, where there might have been alterations. So they moved something. So one layer had 6 layers and another had 20 layers. We could tell it was newer. So a lot can be told by looking at, it's like the rings of a tree. It tells the history. Let's keep going. And then from those, we match them in cross-section to the period of significance. We use the Munsell system, which is that chips over on my left. Then we custom made the colors. We show the glazes, which is the middle sample, where we're showing graduated transparent colors. And we create this palette for what the interior looked like. And of course,
Jeff, forgive me for a potentially very basic question, but in that last slide that you showed, are all the different colors that you that are on those sheets, are those actually pieces from the building, or have you taken a tiny sample and then kind of recreated the colors that you're seeing there?
Yes, those are our paint chips, which we made. We mixed the paint and painted little sheets of paper and then attach them to these boards. And one of the things we do, they're all on with Velcro, so we can literally take them off the board and hold them in the space and look at them under different lighting conditions.
The paint chip itself is itty bitty, and then what you saw on the screen is a blown up photomicrograph, and then we're painting these little sample pieces based on those colors.
Right, including the glazes, which are mostly found through exposure windows, and I'll come to that in a minute. And of course, we didn't have computers back then, so everything was typed. Here's a page from our paint study. It was done in '86. That, as I said, was still completely relevant. That information was captured and was extremely valuable 20 years later when we got to do the actual work. And so in 2006, they were ready for us. They had done the work in the Undercroft. There were all kinds of discoveries made in the building, but we built a very ingenious scaffolding system, or the general contractor did, Terry Higgins, which was this scaffold which moved across the space. So it was little by little by little by little. And once we had access, let's keep going. And here's what it looked like with the scaffolding in place. So we could be on this deck that moved.
You see in the corner that this very darkened patterning. There's actually an exposure window there.
Well, I'll have some better examples of that as we come to them. Let's keep going. So here we are on that blue ceiling on the side aisles, and each one of those, you can see our notes on the blue, but each one of those is an exposure window where we took off one layer of paint at a time. So we have the blue, which is the presenting layer, the beige underneath it, a lighter blue, a varnish glaze. You can see them, another beige. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 layers to get to the original. And then we found not only the colors, but the patterns that we found. I think that's coming up next. Yeah, there we go. So we've actually, and once we found all this decoration, and some of it was really quite intact and stable, the decision was made, and this is a very unusual decision, to do this on this grandest scale. Matter of fact, it's the only project in my 43 years of business where they've decided to preserve all of the original, even though it's simple stenciling. We could have replicated it more economically, and they made the decision, no, this is what was there. We want the original paint. We want you to, we found that we could remove the overpaint successfully, one layer at a time, very carefully with various chemicals. And that became the mandate. That was to reveal as much of the original as possible and get back to that earliest stage and then in paint it. So these are both our exposure windows and then our cleaned up version of it. It is the original paint.
And the original hands of all the people who painted it. I mean, really get that sense of every inch of it being adorned with the loving hands of the people who used it.
Right, and you can see the personality of the artists. It's done in a loose, kind of free way. I wouldn't call it high style. It's kind of slightly folksy and really just wonderful. And you can literally see the personality there. So here's a detail, of the hand painted little, not quite completely correct. It was done largely with pounces, which are the same thing that Michelangelo used to do the Sistine Chapel. It's a piece of paper, it has holes in it. You take a bag full of charcoal and you pounce it, and that's how you transfer the design. And then all this would have been free. This particular pattern would have been freehand painted, and then they went back with glazes afterwards. And so we tried to preserve all of this character, all of this patina of age, even removing the overpaint, what that does to it, and then in paint it without making it look too fresh or new.
And Jeff and Emily, how common is that to walk into a grand sacred space and find underneath other layers of paint this hand-painted motif that is so folksy and human?
A lot more common than you believe. In the 60s and 70s, they painted out an enormous amount of decoration, and styles changed. It was maintenance. For instance, in Eldridge Street, what they did to a lot of the stuff that was high that they couldn't get to, they coated it with varnish, and the varnish darkened. And so that had to be removed. I'll get to that in a second. The lower areas, as a matter of maintenance, they just painted them over and over again. So there was, as I said, some places as many as 20 layers.
Sometimes it's a matter of taste and style. Sort of a more minimalist style became fashionable, and all the decoration got painted over. Sometimes there's damage and no one really knows quite how to fix the original. And so what we see is sort of an attempt at the original style on later generations that is a lot less sophisticated or less well done. And then other times it's damage and no one really knows how to quite fix it. So they just sort of paint it over. But it's not at all uncommon to find many generations of decoration in a sacred space. What's sort of uncommon and really special about Eldridge was the reverence for the original and the desire to go back to that, and those design decisions about making it feel not brand new, not like we were walking into it as if it was in the 19th century, but as if it was lovingly taken care of for 130 years. And so we think about preservation is a science, but there's also always design element, and that's one of the design decisions made.
And I have to say,
go ahead.
We actually have with us in the audience today Roberta Gratz, who was responsible for the founding of the project and the museum. And she just commented that it was really unusual at the time, as we're saying, to preserve rather than repaint. Right. And I think what we're all saying here is that it wouldn't be the same project if we hadn't done that. It really makes the space. And that whole intangible sense of history that we're sort of dancing around. I think what we're talking about is, in many cases, the fact that we can really feel the people's handwork in this art.
It's some time travel when you enter Eldridge, and not just because of the way that it looks. I mean, that feeling.
Well, we're not only preserving the physical, the paint, the bricks, the mortar, the plaster, but we're also preserving the sense of the place. And that's a much more delicate balancing act. And I want to say one other thing, that the interior had evolved over time. So we also had to find a balance between what we were preserving. So it wasn't like we could just go back to one moment in time, because there were layers. Each one represented an evolution at a different point in time, and how to balance and synthesize all of those and make them all fit together, so that it also reflected the ongoing history and evolution of the interior. So that was another sort of balancing act that we had to accomplish, and with great sensitivity too, as to how to accomplish that, and how to respect and maintain that feeling that I had the moment I walked into the place. It's like, how do you not disturb that?
Well, and it tells such a story too, because as we, as a museum, are bringing visitors through the space, we're actually able to point to spaces within the sanctuary where you can see the congregation evolving, using the space over time, making changes, doing things like bringing electricity into the space and how they kind of fit that into their historic space. So it tells the use of a story of the use of the building in a way that a static restoration to just one date and time wouldn't be able to do. So it feels much more dynamic that way.
I agree. So this slide is just some of the technical things that we did. I mean, there was the slide on the left is just taking the dirt off in the varnish layer with solvents and cleaning solutions so that we could preserve as much of what was intact as possible. And I forgot to mention that the patterns, when we did the exposure windows, in some cases, we found that they had used the exact same patterns, the exact same stencils, and they just moved them a half an inch or an inch off. So there was multiple layers of the same exact patterns. And which ones we go back to. And then on the right with the paintbrush, there we're reattaching flakes of paint. So we're putting a consolidant through the tissue paper or laying back down individual chips of paint. And that was the kind of precise care that we took that you might use on an easel painting. And we're applying those same techniques to this rather large piece of architecture. So.
Jeff, maybe this is jumping the gun a little bit, but you mentioned two patterns being one underneath the other and needing to figure out which one you go back to. So am I jumping ahead to ask which one do you go back to?
Well, no, stay where we were. I don't know what happened there. The ghosts are playing with our presentation. So this is a good example, this one. So in that round piece with the rondelle window, you can see that it's half cleaned. So that same pattern is underneath, but there's no point in going back to the pattern underneath, which is, as I said, a half an inch off, because this is part of a moment in time. And it represents the same pattern in that particular case. So the diagonal line, the lower half has been cleaned, the upper half hasn't been. The one on the image on the left is that peeling paint, which you saw us laying back down in the previous slide. So these upper areas were largely original. It was the lower areas that had been redone. And so again, how to just balance all of these periods of time so that they have some cohesion and they all fit together. Does that answer your question? I don't know if I quite answered your question or not.
I think so. So if I heard you right, you didn't take off a layer of the pattern because there's the same one underneath, right? So why take off a layer of paint if you're just going to find the same thing underneath it?
Well, yes, if the presenting, yeah, on that particular pattern, if the pattern is the same and so it's the same imagery, it has the same evocation, it's in good shape. So we have to think about, is it stable? What does it look like? Does it all fit together? And here on the left, we're removing both dirt and a darkened varnish layer, which had to be done with solvents. And then
whereas on those in those little ceilings that we showed, those sort of round ones, there under a bunch of sort of flat paint was all this beautiful decoration that related to the things that are extant that you're looking at right now. So then the decisions could become quite clear about which campaigns relate to each other and how that all makes sense as a whole.
And then where the paint was gone, you can see us using these little tiny brushes and just in painting, the areas where the paint was gone to blend it in. And we use a slightly different color so that in the future, people can tell what was our work, which is reversible, by the way, and what was the original. We want to be able to, in future generations, anyone coming to look at it would be able to clearly tell, oh, this was done, it's modern paint and it's reversible. And then on the plaster, the substrata, we had to consolidate it. Here we are using a hypodermic to inject a consolidant. And so we had to basically every single crack, we would drill these little holes and then inject them with these plaster grouts with adhesives in them. A couple more pictures. Here we are again with the syringes. And this was, doctoring the building with this horse syringes for every single crack, stabilizing it and reattaching the plaster to the wooden lath. Where the lath was where the plaster was completely gone, we put new lath. You can see it in this photograph, and put back traditional 3-coat plaster with horsehair in it. Let's keep going. And then on the ornamental plaster, there's a bit of ornamental plaster. We would either take it off and reattach it, or make a mold of the cast. Here we are making putting on the mold material to make a mold to replicate one of the columns, the capitals, that is. Here, you can see on this photograph all those little squares of paper which are stabilizing the flaking paint, and then we're up in the dome injecting the cracks to stabilize them, so we have a sound surface to then in paint and replicate on. I might add that we were here for more than a year. It was many, many thousands and thousands of hours of work.
I was actually just about to ask that. I had thought that those the white was paint that had flaked, but it's actually pieces of paper that you've attached to the wall to stop it from flaking. And for some reason, it is that really brought home to me just how much work, how much tedious, meticulous work is involved in a project like this. And a year doesn't seem nearly long enough.
It's a definite labor of love, this kind of work.
Yeah. Well, it's a Zen kind of thing. Once you're into it, it's you're paying very close attention at a very small scale, but you can't lose track of the overall, what the zeitgeist, what the whole project is going to be at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Made up of all these little tiny component pieces.
I've got a couple questions right now in the chat about things that we're kind of scrolling past now. So I'll ask, someone has asked the original paints, assuming they would have been lead based. So when you are restoring a space and restoring a pattern that may have used lead paint, what type are you using?
We're using modern paints. In 2006, I think there were still some oil paints that were available back then, but not, of course, not with lead. And I might add that for the protection of all of our workers, all of our work was done wet. So lead is only dangerous when it's not only dangerous, you can't eat this stuff, but when it's dry, it's in the air and you can breathe it and it's very bad for your lungs. But when you're cleaning and you're using things that are wet, you can control it and make sure that it's not dangerous, when you're working around it. But and just as a matter of personal safety, all of our people have lead tests frequently, so we know what their lead levels are. And if they have elevated lead levels, we won't let them work on these projects. So we monitor our people and are very, very safety conscious, in working around, what can be dangerous materials if you're not careful with them. But the paint that we put back is mostly modern paint. In 2006, we were still using some oil glazes and alkyd glazes and primers, shellac-based primers, but largely we're painting in acrylics now.
And then a question from Dawn Ladd of Aurora Lampworks, who is responsible for the restoration of all the lighting fixtures in our sanctuary. She was saying that the space was originally lit by gas. So what does something like that do, gas lighting? What does that do to the wall and the ceiling and all of the existing fixtures in a space?
Well, not only the gas light, but the coal that was used to heat homes. So there's this sort of oily or sebaceous dirt on everything, and that has to be cleaned, and you need a strong surfactant. And as I said, so when we're taking off the darkened varnish layer, we're using a solvent, and that's also taking off the dirt, cutting that oily, greasy dirt, and taking the dirt off as well, so that you have, and you need to do that for two reasons. One, to be able to see it, but also so that whatever you put on top of it will adhere, because it won't adhere to that. And sometimes that's a blessing. When we have a cementitious dirt layer, we can split the paint layer easily at that level because it wasn't properly adhered, because they didn't clean it beforehand. They didn't use good preparation practice. So, and in the cross section, it gives us some sense of how long that layer was exposed to the atmosphere. and at what time. So earlier in the century, the air quality in New York was much worse than later. So here we are, we found marbleizing. We'll go back to the previous slide for a second. Again, there it is. So we found it was so dark you couldn't even see the marbleizing, but when we cleaned it, you could see that the lower walls had been marbleized at one point in time. And then there were some sections that were completely gone, and we replicated those. And that's what we're doing in this one. We're replicating the marbleizing.
In the style that it was done.
Yeah,
originally.
which is a kind of primitive folk style. And also you can see in this, the Capitol, which has been gilded with Dutch metal. And then we patinaed it back down so that it would all be of a piece and fit together.
Dutch metal is sort of a composite leaf as opposed to real gold. Or...
Yeah, they didn't use real gold. At least on the architectural work, they did use real gold on the Bema. That was the only place it was used. And here we are stenciling. So there's both original stenciling and then replicated stenciling that we're trying to tie into there. And I think we did it pretty seamlessly. When you're on site, you really can't tell new from the old unless you put it under a black light, and then you can see that the paint fluoresces differently. The modern paint fluoresces differently than the old paint.
And you, Jeff, mentioning this sort of folksy kind of feeling about the decoration, it really does make you think of like a quilt or something that is done by hand, and that you get kind of blanketed in, and you get that feeling when you're there.
Well, I think this level of decoration, that almost every surface is covered with both a visual texture and a pattern, it has a tendency to humanize the environment, and it all fits together. It's not confusing. It has a way of humanizing that environment and making the space welcome. What it does is it brings the architecture down to a human scale by having the patterns at a certain scale that you can visually digest them. So here we are. You can see we've done the exposure. We've taken off the overpaint, and now we're in painting by hand the same techniques that they used originally.
And these are in areas where the original was completely lost.
Yes. And here's just a picture of us working up in the dome. I think we're getting to the stars here in a minute. Yes. You want to talk about stars, Emily?
Yeah, I was just going to say that, you know, I don't know what our audience's backgrounds is, but just to talk about the how there's many different kinds of sacred spaces, and certainly for some, the building is just a roof and walls where a congregation gathers. But for others, Catholics among them, and certainly within the Jewish tradition, the building is this special dwelling place of God. And so, you know, we can think about King David dancing ecstatically before the ark, that, you know, this is this special place. And so there's all this meaning and you know, throughout, woven in. It's not just decoration kind of ever, but within the Jewish tradition there is a prohibition on the representation of the images of the hidden God. So we have this development of a patterning that's really beautiful. And also we have these stars here, which really recall God's promise to Abraham about giving him descendants more numerous than the stars in the heavens. And so I think when we think about, you know, this community gathering in the Lower East Side, and the tremendous growth there, that promise.
So the stars are not just stars. That's the point. But they can be enjoyed, you know, on a purely visual level, or if one understands what they might mean. So it's interesting that a building like this is a vessel which contains so many levels of meaning and can be understood and read on all these different levels.
Yeah.
And it was intended that way originally. And our job is to both understand that and preserve that so that everyone can participate in the building and read it and be part of it on all these different levels, according to what one's level of understanding might be.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And also,
that-
and this thought too that, in one sense, the building very much represents the people. And the other hand, it also sort of shapes the people. And so, the idea that it's directing the meditations and prayers in a certain way, and that it's participating in this sort of dialogue.
Also, there's another, when you walk into this space, so you have your everyday life, you're working, whatever you're doing on the Lower East Side, and then at the door, you leave your outside world, and now you're in another world. You're transported to another world, and your feeling changes. You can, it's like you take off your dirty clothes, leave them at the door, your shoes or whatever it might be, and you're now in this other type of space.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point, and something that we really treasure as continuing on today. It's a space that certainly every time I walk in, I feel a little bit lighter, a little bit more connected to something, and I think that's part of what makes it so special. And it's really moving to think about the immigrants of the Lower East Side typically spending their time in spaces that looked and felt nothing like this building, and yet having the chance to walk in, like you said, and sort of leave that all at the door.
It's one of the things I think a lot about, particularly in 19th century buildings and early 20th century buildings in America, that we have such stimulation now, on demand on television and on our phones, and we can put earphones on, listen to anything that we want at any time. And so to think about living in tenements and working in factories and walking into the doors of Eldridge Street Synagogue, and what the visual and auditory and olfactory, all of the sensations that you would experience there, such a profound difference from your life anywhere else.
So these are, there were two murals on either side of the beam of wall, with these curtains, which are a common representation of the curtain between this life and the inner sanctum. So, and nice trompe l'oeil and wood graining, and there was wood graining throughout, actually. I forgot to mention that part. So these pictures here, the fascia of the balcony, which was pine, I believe, common wood, was all grained to look like oak, as were the balustrades and the wainscot. All the wood, even though it was wood, was painted to look like wood. And so a lot of that was preserved, and then a lot of it was replicated as well. And then the actual wood, the real wood of the beam of wall is actual wood and was preserved. And there's a on the table where the texts were put, there was a worn spot, and it was I think it was lure, but and a story that they were rubbing this spot over and over again. It's not true, but it's a wonderful story that they had rubbed it so many times, they had rubbed a hole into the wood, and one can imagine, someone up there saying their prayers, davening, and feeling this wood with their hand until it was worn down. But there was actually on the floor, and this is true, this is not a story, you could see how the boards were worn by the paths of all the people who trod on them. So the steps and the floors, you could see the footprints, literally the footprints of all the people. But
yeah, and you still can. Those are still there, those grooves in the floor. Jeff, I want you to continue for a few more minutes, but I also want to let everyone know that maybe in 5 minutes or so, we'll start answering a few more questions. So if you've got questions that you haven't asked yet, get those into the Q&A section, and we will begin to answer them in about 5 minutes.
Yeah, by the way, in both of these photographs, you see that beautiful chandelier, which Dawn restored, which is sort of one of the this is part of the lighting, which is part of the highlight of the interior. It's really incredible. And one of the other things you can also see on the beam of wall that we used, that were exposed filament bulbs were used, which also give this soft light that would have been common to the early Edison lights. So there's that level of authenticity as well. So all of these things, create this ambiance, which is what we were striving for. We're getting near the end in any case. I think we have a few more pictures of the finished space. There's that, the wood, the real wood, the dark.
Look at the ornamentation there. I mean, just like when we love things, we sort of touch them and want to ornament them and decorate them.
It's a human impulse that has been existed really for man all the way back to decorating the caves. Nobody knows what those images really represent, but the notion of putting ornament on things that we build, I believe, comes from our heart beating. That repeated pattern of our heart pumping is the origins of all ornamentation, which is common to every culture and is a fascinating. I mean, for me, it's been my lifelong study. What are the forms of ornament? Why do men ornament? What does it mean? And I think it has this deep, deep meaning on some subconscious level that, right back to the beating of our heart.
And the beating, that heartbeat relationship to the rhythm and ornamentation also always has this connection to procession, which is a part of any kind of religious ritual,
So this is these tablets on the Bema wall, one of which we left, and this is where we use the real gold, by the way, one of which we restored and the other which we left exactly as we found it, as a kind of reminder. And there are a few other places throughout where little windows were left as reminders of what the condition of things were to help tell the story of the resurrection of this incredible building. And then some finished shots of what it looks like today or when we finished. And also we have a few, it's just such a glorious space. It's really quite unique. And then to remember what it used to look like, I put a few of these before and afters in here so you can really see the transformation. And go back one second. In this, if you look up in the gallery there, you can see a little section where the plaster was left with the wood lath. So a reminder of what it used to be like.
It's a funny thing. If we do our job well, you don't know that we've been there because it looks like it's always been well taken care of.
Yeah. Oh, how quickly they forget, right?
Yeah.
Oh, what did you guys do? It doesn't look like you did anything here.
That's actually a question that I did have written down here. So we completed the restoration. You're showing these gorgeous gleaming photos, kind of like a checked box. We finished, but are we done forever? Do we never see you at Eldridge ever again with a paintbrush, or is this an ongoing process?
One needs to take care of it. It's a fine antique, if you will, even if it's a very large antique. So there are ways to clean it. And we find that in my 43-year career, I am going back and touching up some projects which we did, 30 years ago. And all my children worked on this project, both my daughter and my son. And so I've passed on what I've learned in my lifetime to them. And maybe they will, or their children, my grandchildren, maybe they'll get to do the next restoration. So yes, you need to have ongoing maintenance and keep the roof on, no leaks, to maintain it. But and eventually, because we've left so much of the original material intact, and that has already aged 140 years.
40, yeah. Yeah,
140 years. That will age somewhat differently than the modern material which we put on, which presumably will last be a little bit more durable. So it's going to age at different levels at different times, and there's maintenance. I mean, and there's wear and tear just from the use of the space. So this is, I think this is our last picture. This is that space as we found it in 1986, with the ceilings gone, and then based on the paint study that we did in 1986, we still had that information in our typewritten report. we were able to replicate the ceiling decoration and what went on the walls. And so, fortunately, we had that information 20 years on to be able to put this back as accurately as possible. A couple more before and afters there.
This was also the first job site that I visited when I joined Evergreen in 2007, so it's a special place in my heart too.
We brought her out into the battlefield, into the trenches, battle hardened by now. So this is when we finished with the 4 glass block windows, and then a couple of years later, we went back when the Kiki Smith, the glorious piece of artwork, was installed, and then touched that up as well around it. I think that's the next picture. There it is. There it is. So you can see that those 1939 glass blocks were replaced with this wonderful, wonderful piece of art. And so the building continues to evolve. I mean, the fact that they could incorporate Kiki Smith's extraordinary piece of artwork seamlessly into the building, to me, is really a tribute to how it's a living structure. Building continues to live, continues to evolve.
And
as long as people use it and enjoy it, it's not a static moment in time. Right. It's a dynamic building. You think about all the school children who go through there, what it represents to the neighborhood still with the facade. It's a living building, and it continues to be a living building. And I think that's the legacy of the project of Eldridge Street.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think that's part of what makes it so special, to be sure. Jeff and Emily, thank you so much for that, the presentation. It's just fascinating. And I've seen most of those pictures many times, but it never ceases to amaze. I have a couple questions that I will go through here. This one is from the start of the talk. Dave Metzger asks if we know whether the Moorish Middle Eastern style of the facade was requested by congregants or whether or not it was suggested. Where does the inspiration to use that style come from?
Well, I personally don't know the answer to how that came about, but it was common at that time in the late 1800s that there was this movement to design many of the buildings all across the country, in Prague, in Rome, and Florence, in England, with this romantic style, this evocation of, presumably the origins of the Jews in the Middle East. And so it was very popular and interesting in Eldridge Street because, as I said, there are elements of Gothic and Moorish, and it's this conglomeration. So I don't know if there's any written records that you might be familiar with, Chelsea, of the inspiration, but Herder brothers were the architects. They were known to do other similar types of buildings and also regular secular buildings. So I don't know if that answers the question or not. I don't know the actual answer, but it was common. That's why I wanted to show the examples in the beginning of other projects that were similar all across the country, Isaac Wise and Cincinnati, etc.
Yeah, I think you're right that we also don't really have the records that say there was any sort of a design request. I think the story that we tell is largely the story that that surely you helped us shape with your own research, that it was a common style at the time, especially for synagogues.
But I think the thing that, as I said, an understanding which I just came to in the last week or so as I was preparing for this was that as I was looking at these old Polish and Eastern European, Russian wooden shtetl decorations, there's something completely common, even though this was done in this stylistic way, but the interior decoration, the quantity of it, the scale of it, the patterning of it, there's something common to that, to the Eastern European wooden synagogues. And I wonder if that also would make the congregants feel at home, even though they're now in this new country and they have this essentially imaginary style of building, but something familiar with the decoration from where they also came from, to remind them of where, where they had just immigrated from. So I never made that connection before, and it seems real.
I think that's a good point. Danielle Halpern asks two questions. The first one is, was there anything in the building that wasn't able to be restored or replaced?
Oh, much actually. There was rotten plaster that had to be replaced. New mechanical systems, the modern upgrades. The idea was how to hide those and sensitively integrate them. Lighting systems, electrical systems, mechanical systems, all are modern. And actually, really one of the incredible things that we didn't even touch on because it wasn't really part of our project is that the museum exists several levels below the synagogue. So before we could finish the part that the public sees, there are how many levels, Chelsea? 4 levels underneath? Is that right? Do I have that right? I mean, Terry Higgins.
I think you might know about a level I don't know about.
Oh, the secret level, all right.
Yeah, that one's just for you, I guess. I think there are 2 levels to the sanctuary, the main level and then the balcony level, and then the building goes down 2 underneath that first level. But
you've never been to the secret vaults, huh?
I've never been. Yeah, I can't wait to go.
But the fact that they excavated under the building and did all this modern work and put everything under there without disturbing the building at all is, that was a kind of engineering feat in and of itself. So I don't know if that answers the question or not.
Danielle's other question is, how did both of you get into restoration as a career, and what advice do you have for someone who's interested in the field?
Oh, a series of left turns. I was trained as a painter and became interested in fresco painting, which led me to learn about plastering, which led me into architecture. I've just pursued my interests and they've grown. Poor Emily, we kind of roped her into this thing, and she's,
as a kid.
Yeah, as a kid. Go ahead, Emily. You can.
No, it's all kind of providential that I ended up getting to work with Jeff and Evergreen, but my background's in art history, and I got a phone call from a recruiter when I was, fairly new out of grad school, but I was really excited about the prospect to work. I didn't know that this kind of work existed really, but I fell in love with it quickly and into this niche of working specifically with religious buildings. I really loved that religious communities understood that art has a function. It's not just frivolous decoration. It really has this important job, and that it works. And I just sort of fell in love with that. It was an interest that I had before, and it was really very much nurtured at Evergreen. So it was all providential.
Someone asked why the project timeline was so long. Why did it take decades, and is that typical?
I will let Roberta answer that one, but it takes money to get projects done. And it took a long time to make people aware of this wonderful place. And it was unknown, and to raise the money little by little by little. So we did tiny phases of projects, waiting for grants, waiting for government money. That I would say that's why it took 20 years. And but much to Roberta's credit, she's like a rock. She just stayed at it, and she just stayed at it. She just stayed at it, and she was passionate about it and saw it through. And the energy really never. So it's not unusual to have projects. I mean, I'm working on another project right now that I first looked at in 1985 in Oklahoma City, and it's been through 4 or 5 different ownerships. and it's finally happening, and we're delighted to be there. So a 20-year project is not unheard of, but oftentimes what happens is there's roadblocks or delays, but in this one, there was this consistent attention, and that didn't waver, very much on Roberta's part. I mean, we're all, our gratitude is to her to keep the vision going, and so I don't know.
I mean, it's not uncommon to, sometimes projects will contact us and they're ready to go and they're making it happen this year. But I always feel like these projects all kind of happen in God's time, because there's definitely, I get phone calls about a proposal that I wrote 10 years ago, and we're finally, someone's interested in doing it. And it's that momentum. And also that, it's these projects happen, as Jess said, because someone really cares about making them happen. And they share that enthusiasm, and people fall in love with what the building means and what it, in its past, and what it could mean in the future. Because I like that one of the definitions of preservation is a conversation with our past about our future. So, it's not about this nostalgic thing. It's about really sharing with the community, be that local, or as it was with Eldridge Street, national,
International.
Yeah, international, right. I mean, so why this building in a different state or a different city or a different country matters to you, and why it's important to your grandchildren in the future, and I think that telling that story, because architecture can and does really affect us. And so, and this story is a really beautiful case of how and why.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of playing the long game, and not only being patient with sticking, 1,000 pieces of paper up onto a dome, but like you're saying, being patient for when the funding comes in, or when the time is right for that project. I guess if you're talking about hundreds of years for a building, maybe a decade isn't so long to wait.
Well, think about it this way. The people there in prior times, the people who built this building built it to represent something, and they didn't represent it just for their lives. They weren't thinking about their own lifetime. They wanted to build something that would last, that would have value and meaning, and represent what they believed and what they believed in for all times. So when we're restoring buildings, and I think this is true of all preservation, why do we choose certain buildings to preserve and others not? Which ones represent value? And I don't mean value in terms of dollars. I'm talking about, meaning for us, all right? They're meaningful for us. That's the value of the building. And different objects, whether they be, actual physical objects or buildings, can be imbued with different meanings at different levels, as I spoke about before. But if you think about the mind of the people who built it, they weren't building it for themselves. They were building it for future generations. And that comes through why do they choose these styles? Why do they lavish all this attention, all this detail on the building? They were trying to, everyone recognizes quality when somebody cares about something and pays attention to it. You can feel that, you understand that, you recognize that. And that's all cultures for all times everywhere. If somebody cares about something and they pay attention to it, they're imbuing that object with what could be love, could be care. It's meaning on some levels, on many levels, hopefully. And a vessel like Eldridge Street is a container big enough to contain many, many, many layers of meaning for many different people on many different levels. And that's why it's significant. It's not ephemeral. It's meant to last. And so our job is, temporary custodians, if you will, is to, get it a little bit further down the road till the next generation, the next generation, the next generation can appreciate it and find their own value and their own meaning in it. And the wonderful thing is that it's evolved and it's adaptable. That's why it's living. It's not static. It's not nostalgia, as you said. I mean, what's the expression? Nostalgia is good nostalgia. So
Well, I think that's a great place to wrap up. Jeff and Emily, thank you both so much for your time and sharing your enthusiasm and your expertise with us. It's been a really wonderful conversation.
Thank you for having us.
It's our pleasure.
Yeah, really. It's one of my all-time favorite projects ever. So I love the people who are involved with it, and it's a good. As I said, I
It's a
frankly,
mutual-
I'm in love with the building, so I hope that comes through. So,
Yeah, I was going to say it's a mutual appreciation society for sure.
okay.
Thank you so much, all of you, and thank you to our audience members too for joining us tonight. I really hope that we'll all get to meet together in Eldridge Street in person sometime soon. Everyone, I invite you all to stay connected with us through our website, through social media. Restoring Stories, this program is just part one. Next up, Dawn Ladd from Aurora Lampworks is going to be joining us, and we're going to be talking about her restoration work. We will be talking about our stained glass windows as well, and there will be much more to come. So thank you all again, and I hope you have a wonderful evening. Thanks.
Good night.
Good night.
Bye.